In this video, I am showing you how we did the windows for our greenhouse. These we did out of reclaimed windows, so there were a few extra steps to it. And I know there's multiple different ways of doing things, but go ahead and take a look at what we did, and maybe it will give you some ideas of how you can take old windows and make them into a beautiful greenhouse. Now we still have painting to do, we still have caulking to do, but those are all going to be part of the finishing process.
Preparing the antique windows is one of the more difficult, more tedious tasks of this project. I have 39 windows that I'm installing in this greenhouse, and I've been able to collect a fair number of them, actually more than 39. Some of them match, some of them don't match, but that's kind of part of the beauty of this project. Is it's this eclectic, fun collection, you know? When you're preparing the window, the really important things to have are your air compressor, window glazing, razor blades, rags, towels, hot soapy water, maybe even a chisel, a screwdriver so that you can remove any hardware that could possibly be in the way. I like leaving the hardware if it's not going to be in the way of the installation, but sometimes something will be installed either on the top or the bottom of the window, and you need to get that out of the way so that it'll fit inside the hole. And then it's just a matter of, you know, going over, washing the window. If I have some areas where the dirt really tends to stick, then I'll use a magic eraser on that portion. I use the air compressor to get off all the spider webs, which is great because then I'm much more willing to work with it. And it gets rid of any loose dirt, any loose paint, and it just allows you to see if there is anything loose there. The glazing on the window can sometimes get a little bit loose or has already fallen out, and if that's the case, then you need to replace that. And then if there's any broken panes, those need to be replaced as well. You still want to keep the character of the window. You want it to be, you know, you want it to have that antique, old, rustic look to it, but you also want it to withstand the tests of time. Any paint or caulking that's on the window pane and doesn't look good, doesn't have a straight line, you're going to want to use that razor blade to go ahead and scrape it off and give it a nice clean feel. The interior portion of the window has the deeper recessed portion of it, whereas the exterior is a little bit shallower, and it has that glazing that's at a diagonal level from the glass, so that if any rain gets on it, it will go away from the glass, away from the frame, so that it will last longer. And that portion of the window, that glazing, is usually the stuff that's the most vulnerable to age. If you do end up having to replace a pane of glass in the windows, it's not really that big of a deal. It seems a little bit overwhelming, the thought of it, but it's really not too bad. The first thing that you have to do is break out the old glazing and then pull out your window. It will generally be held in place by little diamond-shaped metal pieces that are kind of shoved into the wood. You want to pull those out, and I save those because I reuse them. You could get different ones. I can't remember what they're called, but there is a specific name for them. If anyone else knows, they can go ahead and put it in the comments below. And then once you get that old window out, I use, if it's intact enough, I use that kind of as my template for cutting the next one, but I would say try to cut it like a tiny bit smaller than the one that you pull out, because if you get it exact, it may actually be just a little bit too big, and it's really hard to cut a tiny bit off a piece of glass, whereas doing a larger portion is not so bad. When working with the cut or broken glass, I really recommend wearing leather gloves that can protect you just a little bit. Additionally, when you go to cut it, use some kind of straight edge, and you'll want to go ahead and score a little bit more at the top edge, a little bit more at the bottom edge, and then using a pretty heavy hand, go ahead and press that metal blade, the glass cutter, into the glass itself pretty firmly. And then you just have to elevate right along the score line and press, and it should break exactly where it's at. If for some reason you end up grabbing tempered glass, it will not work. The tempered glass breaks into tiny bits as soon as you try to cut it. It almost looks like it explodes. It's quite impressive, actually. And then it's just a matter of putting your pane of glass back in and adding the little metal stake things for holding it in the right spot and putting your glazing around the edges. I tend to like using a razor blade to cut my glazing and then just kind of use my fingers to make it nice and smooth and the razor blade to make it look like it has a little straighter edge. And then after that, you need to allow it to dry for like 7 to 10 days in a warm environment. It's got to be like above 40 degrees. And then you need to paint over the top of it, and that just kind of seals it in. It's a lot of steps, but it's really not that bad. The important thing with this glazing is to make sure that it's angled away from the window so that any rain or precipitation or, moisture, sprinklers, is going to go away from the glass and away from your frame and make them last just that much longer. It's not perfect, but it's definitely better than a broken window pane. So I've already painted over the portions of the window that I felt like needed to be painted over, which, you might not believe it with all the cracks and stuff that are in this window, but those actually I want to preserve. The things that I covered were over the glazing itself, and then if there was any like particularly dirty spots that I couldn't scrub the stains out, or large patches of maybe a different color that I didn't want showing. But I really like this kind of crackled look. What I'm trying to achieve is a little bit difficult because I want to preserve my wood, preserve my windows, but I also want to preserve this old look. And so what I'm doing is I'm going over this with a wood sealant. It doesn't do any good for the paint portion, but any of the cracks where the wood is showing, so it's exposed to the weather, the sealant gets inside of those cracks and will help protect the wood at that point. As more paint chips off, eventually I might need to paint it, and at the very least I'll probably need to do more coats of the wood sealant. You can determine how you want to do it. I thought about doing some polyurethane, but I was afraid that it would yellow out in the sun. So, there's multiple different options, but this is what I chose to do. I'm using Thompson's Water Seal, which is really good for dry, porous, old wood, which means it's just perfect for this project. Before I'm able to put the windows in, what I have to do is make a little lip that goes around the outside, and then I'll put the window in and sandwich it on the outside. So what I'm doing is taking boards that I've cut that are 3/4 of an inch one way, 3/4 of an inch the other way, but one of those is angled at 10 degrees. And you want to have it so that it's angling away from the window. And then you have to go and put it around every single one of these windows. So it's going to take quite a long time. I'm just showing you the one. And I put those in with finishing nails because anything bigger than that is going to be a problem. I'm really excited about putting the windows in. It's super easy to do. All I do is I put a little shim on the bottom if it needs it. I put my window in, and then I sandwich it in with some boards that are cut at 3/4 of an inch. And that's it. I use my little finishing nailer. It goes in super smooth, super easy. You do have to figure out which side is the front versus the back. And if you have any unsquareness to your building, then you might have some difficulty. Fortunately, we haven't actually had any trouble with our walls. There was one window that we had some trouble with just because it had a corner of it kind of ripped off. But I'm going to go back in later with caulking when it gets warm enough and just fill that space in. So you just do the best you can. There is a little lip at the bottom of a lot of my windows, not all of them. And so it makes it so that one of those boards is pushed out slightly more than the other ones. And I just match up the side boards to the board that's on top and the board that's on bottom. And there'll be a little gap there, but again, I'll fill that in with the caulking. The rest of the windows just go in the same. It's not that big of a deal, but it does take a fair amount of time, especially since there tends to be a little fine tuning of the boards where sometimes one that fit on the bottom is slightly off from the top. If you have a little bit of a gap, it's not that big of a deal to fill it with caulking later. Just try to keep them minimal. Don't forget to watch for our next video in this series where we will be finishing out the greenhouse.